future of the metaverse will look like. We don't have that yet, despite all of our data centers all over the world, between Google and Azure and AWS. There still isn't enough compute to make it happen. And to
Yeah.
me, that's crazy because we think we're living in the golden era of what's possible. And it'll need to get even bigger.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today we have Carly Taylor. Carly is a senior manager at Activision, leading a team of machine learning engineers to tackle disruptive behaviors in the game Call of Duty. Previously, she has held various roles, including machine learning engineer, data scientist, product analyst, analytical chemist. She has a master's degree in computational chemistry from University of Colorado. She's passionate about video games and cybersecurity. She shares her insights on machine learning, gaming, and career with 33,000 LinkedIn followers. And if you enjoy the show, subscribe to the channel and give us a 5-star review. Welcome to the show, Carly.
Yay! Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So you studied chemistry in college and grad school. How did you get into data science?
Oh gosh, when I was in grad school, I was working in a basement, a literal basement underground. And our lab next door was doing these crazy experiments on mice, giving them cocaine to see like how addictive behavior starts. And I looked around and I was like, do I really want to be a basement person for the rest of my life? And I
Yeah.
decided, I think that while I love chemistry, the job market is just not what I want it to be. And I had already had a stint as an analytical chemist, as you mentioned, and it just wasn't what I had anticipated, right? And a bunch of my friends were getting poached by fintech companies to be this new term called data scientist,
Mm.
because the industry had learned that these people with physics and chemistry and math backgrounds would actually do really well to build these trading algorithms. And I saw them getting these flashy jobs and these big salaries. And I was like, how do I do that? And my friend was like, learn how to code. And I was like, all right. And that kind of jump started everything data for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So you then started in your career in product analyst, marketing analyst, and then how did you get into machine learning in gaming?
Yeah. So it was easier to make the jump for me to analyst roles because I didn't have any like formal machine learning training. And so I was kind of poking around in tech, trying to find out like what exactly I wanted to do. So I did. I worked in marketing for a little while, and I really enjoyed that. But I wanted to be closer to the engineers who were building things. So I pivoted to product and realized like I love this. I loved doing analysis for the business and finding insights, but I didn't have the skills to do anything predictive. So I was like very much looking in the past and trying to figure out what had happened. And I wanted to be able to say, and if we did this, we think this might happen.
Mm.
And I just didn't have any of those skill sets already. And so I decided to go to a boot camp, and I did a 3-month data science boot camp. I quit my job. It was really scary. I had nothing lined up. I was like, I sink or swim. And that's how I got started in data science. And I was lucky enough to find a job right after boot camp, doing a little bit of like chemistry/data science in
Mm.
the energy industry. And that's how I got more into machine learning.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think a great way to transition is to leverage your current domain to do
Yeah.
data science in your example, in a lab in chemistry, and then once you have the data science experience, you can go to any other industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Use those
Yeah.
little stepping stones for what you already know.
Right. And what made you want to work in gaming?
So I've been a gamer my whole life. I grew up playing video games. My first console was Super Nintendo, and I played the Lion King game probably 500 times.
Mhm.
And so I've always loved playing video games, and I found it like an outlet for relaxation. I continued that into like adulthood and in my career, and so I would play on the side. The pandemic really solidified that for me when we were all stuck inside. We had nothing to do, but I was able to hop on Call of Duty with my friends and, get on the headset. And it was a way for us to like kind of like hang out together while social distancing. And then while that was all going on, there was a post for a job at Activision as a data scientist. And I was like, this can't be happening. My favorite game is hiring for my new career.
Hmm.
And then I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to get this job, though, because, I've only been in the industry for about a year as a true data scientist. And my, soon to become boss had a background in physics, and he just really kind of understood my career path. And I think that that made it a lot easier for me to make that transition and, to have some kindred spirits who had gone from academia to tech and then in gaming. And so it
Yeah.
was kind of serendipitous, just right time, right place.
Hmm.
I feel like I got pretty lucky.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, can you tell us a little bit of where you're currently working on in a space?
Yeah, so I am a senior manager, like you said, doing focusing on our security strategy. So that includes everything that we would put under the umbrella of disruptive behavior. One thing we've noticed as people have flocked to platforms, and I think this is true for all of tech, right? This is true for LinkedIn, this is true for Facebook, is that you have people who are good community members who drive positivity and who are really engaged. And then you have people who are really engaged, but in a negative way, right? And who bring kind of toxicity and bad behavior with them. And it's becoming more apparent that data science is really perfectly positioned to kind of find those anomalous people.
And can you share more about how did you use machine learning to tackle disruptive behavior?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really interesting. This kind of goes back to when I was in my boot camp. I remember we were given some data that was fraudulent credit card transactions, and it was already labeled. And the whole point was find the fraud, find make a predictive model to find people who are committing fraud. And I loved it. I loved anomaly detection. I loved working with unbalanced data sets, kind of focusing on the outliers instead of maybe discarding them or normalizing your data so that you don't have them anymore. And I realized, like, oh, this would be a really cool area of data science to focus on. What I didn't realize was that in the real world, and I'll use again the credit card transaction data as an
Hmm.
example, every time you find someone doing something wrong, the act of classification changes their behavior. So
Yeah.
let's say we have a machine learning model that's trying to find credit card fraud, right? You build all these features. And one of your features, let's say, is like someone makes a purchase more than 100 miles from their billing zip code, right? So it's kind of like, oh, that's far away from where they live. Maybe we should take a second look at that transaction. In setting up those features and in creating your model, you're going to hone in on certain behaviors, right? And unlike other behavioral modeling, maybe you're making a recommendation system where there's
Hmm.
user feedback, but it's not purposeful behavioral feedback from users to game the system.
Right.
You'll actually pick up on behaviors like buying things 100 miles from where the person lives, and you'll
Hmm.
change the behavior of the fraudsters. They're going to
Yeah.
start shopping close to where the zip code is of the card that they stole so that they can get away with fraud. And it's created a really interesting position for me where I look at the standard machine learning workflow where you train a model, or you build your features, train a model, you deploy it to production, you watch it for drift, you retrain periodically. The step we have to go back to really hone in on like bad behavior because people try to get around it is like the feature engineering. So you almost have to rebuild from the ground up every time.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I think maybe we can just use analogy of credit card fraud to talk about fraud detection, anomaly detection in general. And I think our listeners can still get a lot out of our conversation. So one thing I read from the blog post you shared with me that there's a update on the anti-cheat work published by Call of Duty, and one mitigation is not to completely remove the cheaters, but to disarm, take their weapons away, while still keep the cheaters in the game to analyze their data while reducing their ability to impact a legitimate player's experience, which I think is very smart. You disarm the cheater, but you still want to analyze their data so you can have more understanding of their behavior and build better models Can you expand more on this project and this approach?
Yeah, I think that, this is something that, while novel for gaming, has been in use, I think, in other platforms for a long time, right? There's this idea that if you are a bad actor on Facebook, they might limit the reach of your posts. Same with LinkedIn, right? And you might not know that you're not reaching the same audience as someone who maybe wasn't tagged as a problematic person. So you still think that you're communicating with normal people, but really what happens is you're kind of just yelling into the void and no one's seeing anything that you're
Yeah.
doing, right? And it's a good way to get around kind of like if you tell people that actually their posts and content isn't getting to others, they'll make a new account so that they can continue their harassing behavior. But if you let them continue to kind of shout into the void, it will take them longer to figure out that their behavior isn't having the intended impact that maybe they had wanted. And, I think that psychologically, a similar thing happens with the mitigations. When people act out, they do so for a variety of reasons, right? They want to troll people, they want to cause other people to lose a game, or they want to cause anguish, right? They really enjoy the feeling of feeling superior. So if you let them do what they're doing, but they're not effective at it, you're just kind of like, have, good luck.
Yeah, that's very interesting to understand their psychology, their motivation. And previously, you mentioned about feature engineering. I think it's very interesting. So, in general, so if you're working on like fraud detection, the type of use cases where is highly adversarial. The bad behavior, the bad actors can constantly adjust based on the model. So, how can you? What are some strategies in feature engineering that you can make your model more robust?
So the first is to not just rely on one set of behaviors or one set of indicators, right? Like I mentioned, location. So that might be one really good feature for your model, and it might be highly predictive, but you should have a bunch of other features. Even if that at the time of training you find that certain features aren't highly predictive for your model, as long as they're not harming your ability to classify, my approach has always been to leave them in there. Because as the behavior changes, you'll find that your features that have the most importance will also shift. And you don't want to throw something away that might actually end up being predictive next week when what you did was, actually change the behavior of the system. On the feature engineering side, too, you don't know until it's in production either,
Hmm.
like exactly how good any of your features are going to be. So you really need to have a very close relationship with your model and watch it. And I think other models I've built didn't need to be babysat as much as these did. But like I said, like drift is not just something that is expected because that happens in a production environment, it's expected almost immediately. And so you need to be very proactive about model drift and anticipate that your model could start to drift in as few as 3 days, right? And
Yeah.
for other systems, that might not be the case. You might get a week, you might get a month, you
Mm.
might even get a season out of some models, right? Like you could go the whole winter with the exact same behavior. For this, you really don't get that kind of leeway. And so it makes it just more time consuming, I would say.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And in other words, I think it's kind of like a sort of augmentation of the data. And as a data scientist, I think sometimes doesn't mean sometimes if we scrape some online data, um, those data might also be augmented.
Perhaps, honestly, I think that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Some a place like Twitter comes to mind, right? Because they've come under fire a lot
Mm,
for having, what some people would say is like a very opaque algorithm that, puts content up or silences certain people. Now, when you start talking about, maybe you're going to scrape Twitter sentiment data, you need to be aware that that might not be the whole picture, you know.
yeah.
And so there's a huge push in the machine learning community and in leadership for these communities to make things more explainable and kind of
Hmm.
shine a light on the algorithms. And that's always made me laugh because I think that's a stance for people who have never done machine learning. It's easy for them to say that they're going to do this, right? They're like, I'm going
Yeah.
to make this interpretable. And it's like,
Hmm.
how? Like at any given point, what would you do to shine
Hmm.
more light on what this algorithm is doing so that people can understand? And I think that if someone could figure out how to do that, they'd be a billionaire, right? Because all of us are always in search of interpretable machine learning. And whether or not that's easy to do, to me, it doesn't seem very simple.
Yeah. And previously, I read some discussion on Twitter talk about, oh, what if we make Twitter algorithm open source? So people,
Yeah,
if someone get banned, we know exactly why we get banned. And I thought, oh, this is a good idea. But after I talked to you, I just realized, well, that's from the perspective of a kind of a good user. But then bad actors can look at the algorithm. Oh, okay, this is how you get banned. I can just avoid those rules and still do something spammy on
yeah,
Twitter.
exactly.
And so in this way, this type of transparency is not quite necessary.
Yeah, it's really hard. And, you know, not to say that transparency isn't good. I think
Hmm.
that, the push for more transparent machine learning behind the scenes, because algorithms do control our, basically every day, like
Yeah.
our entire lives. So it's good, but I'd say it's a noble cause that maybe doesn't understand the full implications of what it's trying to do. Because that's something you do if you want way more Bitcoin spam in Twitter and you want it to
Yeah.
become almost unusable because it's overrun with people who are trying to make a quick buck. So it's always a trade off.
Hmm. Yeah. And besides the constantly change of the um, uh, cheaters or bad actors' behavior, what are some other challenges in machine learning, data science, and gaming?
I would say that probably the biggest challenge, but the most exciting part about it is just the scale of the data.
Mm.
So when you get down to like the really nitty gritty levels of what we're looking at, we have in a Warzone match, which is our battle royale game, you can have, 100 people playing against one another all online at the same time in different parts of the world. Each of those players is sending data to our servers every 16 milliseconds. And every movement that they make has to be captured because it's the way that we, make sure that the game world is performing as necessary. And so that everyone knows what everyone else is doing. That's how you figure out who won the game, right? How everyone's moving. And so when you think about that, and then you think about the scale of the game, right? We don't just have one game going on at any time. We have you know, thousands. The scale of the data can be overwhelming at times. When you start thinking about even training certain models on really robust clusters in cloud data centers, it does still become overwhelming. And I think a lot of big tech companies have this problem and are trying to face down, how do we better architect our data infrastructure to be more robust? And I think that gaming is perhaps on the forefront of this, but also lagging behind because battle royales and these like large online games are pretty nascent. And we haven't really had to come to terms, maybe like Facebook did early on, with
Mhm.
what does a perfect data infrastructure look like and what does a performant architecture look like that's built with machine learning in mind. um, and trying to re-architect things behind the scenes while you're also still shipping games is really hard because you never have downtime, right? It's
Yeah.
always on.
Yeah.
um, and it's just a unique challenge, but I think it's something that the industry is really taking head on and is really interested in solving.
Hmm. Yeah. For example, for your team, how are you solving this problem?
Oh, we work really closely with our data engineers. Honestly, I think that they're like the heroes of
Yeah.
data science, really. Like they make everything work. So for us, we're always looking for ways to do things faster, right? That's kind of the name of the game when you're talking about disruptive behavior, is that the
Hmm.
longer you let it go on, the worse things get. So how can we make decisions as quickly as possible? And so we're really pushing the limits of what we were like set up to do from a machine learning perspective. So that means like getting into streaming infrastructures, trying to figure out what does streaming data science and real-time data science look like in the gaming world. And I don't think that there's been a perfect answer to
Hmm.
this, right? Because the considerations between our dedicated servers and our cloud servers and where all the data lives, round trip times to get to other data centers, right, is always just where you put something is a really critical decision that can mean making a decision in 5 minutes or making a
Hmm.
decision in 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I previously interviewed a machine learning engineer from LinkedIn. He's also working on
That's awesome.
using machine learning to tackle online abuse. And because of the difference of this industry, his model doesn't have to be online. So I think they have some sort of
Oh,
audit every few
yeah.
weeks, every few months to review whether this is a maybe it's a spam account or something. And but in the
Okay.
game, you actually have the live players experience you have to take care of. So you do need
Yeah,
to have an online model to make decisions quickly. So that
we
adds to
do.
the
Yeah.
challenge.
And we think, every game has an endpoint. Someone's going to
Mhm.
win. And the
Yeah.
worst thing that can happen is to have a cheater win a game. And
Mhm.
so at every point in time, you're really counting down to this inevitable conclusion unless someone else steps in, right? And it ups the stakes quite a lot because if you're off by, like I said, 5 minutes, it could mean that that person just won a game and ruined the experience for 100 other people.
Yeah.
Um, and then you catch them in the next game, but it's like there's already been damage done.
Mhm. Yeah. And you've been an avid gamer yourself. So how has your gaming experience helped you become a better data scientist or machine learning engineer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, just because I do a lot of hiring now, that playing games is not always like a necessity. I think that
Okay.
there's a lot of transferable skills for what we do. But for my particular role, I think that there's an inflection point of being a woman in gaming, being reluctant at times to get on the headset because when someone hears that they're playing with, a female, they'll not everyone, but some people start with the harassment and the negative behavior. And so having experienced that kind of toxicity firsthand, I think makes me feel more like what I'm doing matters and more invested personally in the mission of, making gaming a safer space for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think when you're closer to the problem, maybe you're more invested. But it's also
Mhm.
there's a negative side, right? Because you can't be so emotionally invested in your work because if someone gets through, you feel like you failed. And so there's a lot that goes along with like, okay, protect your mental health, take a step back. It's not
Mhm.
life or death, it's still a game. And so there's a push and pull there, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. I do think you have to kind of use, if you have the opportunity to use the product that you work on, so you have
Yeah.
more empathy. You also
Hmm.
understand the entire kind of how your product work with other elements
Yeah.
in entire business. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So previously, you also mentioned you are passionate about data security. Is this something you part of your work in Activision, or just something in general you care about?
So I do this in Activision, yes, right? Because the
Hmm.
security of our data pipelines and our models is extremely important. But I also do care about this just as like a side interest of mine.
Yeah.
I think that as we've seen with, um, really like high visibility hacks that have happened in recent years, like solar winds and lapsus and a bunch of like bad actors who are able to get access to data they shouldn't have.
Hmm.
It's really put security at the forefront of my mind in my personal life and in my work life. And so now, I love reading about cybersecurity. It's a new field for me, but there's this whole underground world of like white hat hackers whose entire career is just trying to break into places. They try to break in, online to people's infrastructure. They try to break in physically to buildings. Like you could hire
Mhm.
someone right now to try to break into your building and
Wow.
see like where your security falls apart. And I just think it's a really interesting world that a lot of us don't necessarily feel like we're exposed to all the time.
Yeah. And for data scientists, what are some risks you think they need to be aware of, and how can they protect their data?
I think now the one that I worry the most about is our social engineering hacks.
Hmm.
And I think that has become a natural progression of the kind of like hacking community as everyone is becoming more and more online, right? So you mentioned at the top of our conversation, I post on LinkedIn a lot about my experiences. I put a lot of personal information on there about my life. If someone were to use that in a bad way, they could do all sorts of things from impersonating me to trying to get me to tell them something by pretending to be someone, just by having some information that I post publicly. Right. So I think for data scientists in general, it's always good to be cognizant of your online footprint, who maybe knows what you do and where you work. If you have a high profile role or you're working somewhere that, everyone, maybe you're working at Apple or Google or somewhere that's like really high profile, um, your security people at your job are your friends. You probably have an internal security team that is, works for your company, making sure everything is secure. Introduce yourself to these people, like you're both doing similar jobs, working on data, working in tech. Um, and make sure that if someone emails you and asks you for your password, you don't send it to them.
Yeah, I remember when I worked in Amazon, every few months we'll have this training and
Uh-huh.
giving us awareness of the social engineering. And yeah, like you mentioned, someone can give you a call, pretend they're their VP, and ask
Hmm.
for your password and those type of things. So you are also interested in the metaverse, and can you talk about um, what are the challenges in kind of data science in the metaverse?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and something I'm not even totally sure about yet because
Mhm.
I don't know that anyone fully knows what this idea of the like metaverse is going to look like. From my perspective, there are a few players who are kind of on the forefront of this. We're making big moves. Obviously, Meta comes to mind because they rebranded themselves
Yeah.
just for that purpose. But I think that there's been a lot of misunderstanding that came along with that. You know, Meta came out and was like, we're changing our name. And everyone's like, we don't trust Facebook to begin with. And without further education into what the metaverse might look like, I think that they really did everyone a disservice by just like name dropping it and then walking away. And so for data science in particular, anytime there's like a disruption in the way things are done, or there's a place that people are flocking and by definition bringing their data to when they move, right? They're
Mhm.
generating more data, more interesting data. I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for data scientists. So people who look at user behavior, I think are going to be kind of on the forefront of this because companies are going to need to understand what people are doing, why, how they can monetize that better, how they can better protect the online experience, right? There's going to be a lot of need for security there as well. Um, and how to really understand what users really want, right? Because this is going to be something that's kind of brand new and we're not totally sure what's going to land and what's going to be exciting and what's going to flop, and be the next like Google Plus.
Yeah. And if you think about gaming, it's already kind of a metaverse, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Epic Games, I just saw a job posting today. They're hiring like a strategic, people have like metaverse in their title over there now. There was
Wow.
someone who's like a metaverse strategist, and then there's
Hmm.
people doing metaverse data science already, and I think a lot of that is just marketing because, again, what they're doing isn't so different from what a lot of gaming companies are doing.
Hmm.
But the Epic really embracing the idea of the metaverse, I think has like forced other gaming companies to come along for the ride, which is exciting because it's a sink or swim environment. You know what I mean? To have these, like I was saying earlier, these massive online experiences where you have people from all over the world in a single game. This was ideated a long time ago, and games like World of Warcraft have had, tons of people online playing concurrently for a long time. But it was different because when you went to a different world, you had to load up a different server. And so there were all these different kind of areas of the world, but they were isolated. Um, what's happening now is that you have one centralized server that's holding the entire world. And as compute gets better and we are able to offer better online concurrent experiences, that ability to make it even make matches bigger, make experiences bigger, get metaverse concerts with 100,000 people in them becomes even easier. And I think that's kind of the forefront of what people are looking at, right? Like if you're in distributed systems architecture right now, like you're in the right place to be.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting point. I haven't thought about it. So basically, in a metaverse, that means you're working with more geolocations, so
Mm-hmm.
distributed data, and different users also have different cultures. I think previously, um, I know sometimes companies have their like database that they kind of have different type of website launched in
Mm-hmm.
different locations. So analytics are done separately, and now you need
Yeah.
to put them together, the time zones, the cultural difference, and different behaviors like you mentioned. I think that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to be cool. I mean, this has the potential to be the great equalizer or
Hmm.
someone who, is like a baker in real life can, in the metaverse, they're like an expert swordsman or something, and it will be a place for people to reinvent themselves if that's what they want. But like you said, it's going to be a really exciting mishmash of a bunch of different cultures, a bunch of different people all over the world who have different expectations and needs and, different beliefs about what community means. And
Hmm.
so I don't know where you start to tackle it, but I think it will be fun to look into that data when it happens.
Yeah. And what are some other aspects about the metaverse that you think is exciting?
Let's see. The user behavior, definitely. I think, like I said, so distributed systems for me is something I'm really passionate about as well. That's part of my security remit is making sure that, our distributed systems are utilized in a way that's safe and secure.
Hmm.
So anyone who's working now on server architectures, microservices, that side of data science or data engineering or machine learning engineering, I think will be they're already at the forefront, right? Of like jobs that are
Mm,
hiring. You're like, could you build us like full Kubernetes architecture? Sure. They'll be even more in demand, I think, as time
mm,
goes on. So to me, what is going to power the metaverse is almost as exciting as what's going to happen in it because we don't necessarily have everything we need to make what a lot of people think the future of the metaverse will look like. We don't have that yet. Despite all of our data centers all over the world, between Google and Azure and AWS, there still isn't enough compute to make it happen. And to
yeah.
me, that's crazy because we think we're living in the golden era of what's possible. And it'll need to get even bigger. So
Hmm.
buy your
Yeah.
graphics cards now.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is some skills that are going to be more important. For example, the you mentioned microservices or Kubernetes, and to just have a general idea of how compute works. I think this is a little bit different than just like data engineering. It's in
Mm-hmm.
the system
Yeah.
design, a little bit of DevOps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's going to be, I mean, like we saw a machine learning engineer come out of this like confusing area between data science and data engineering. And data engineering came out of this confusing area where data scientists were expected to be engineers. I think there's going to be a new role that comes out of this confusing area between, like you said, systems design and data engineering.
Hmm.
And, what
DevOps.
that ends up
Yeah.
being. Yeah, DevOps, machine
Yeah.
learning ops, all of that,
Hmm.
like what is that going to be? Is it going to be like metaverse engineer? I don't know.
That sounds
But
like
that's going
cool
to be another
title.
catch-all that'll need to get broken up into 10 different titles.
Yeah. I think for data scientists, that means we don't have to be expert in everything, but if that's part of your job, maybe you can just learn a little bit about it, even if that's not your core responsibility, but make it easier for you to collaborate with other engineers, work on the kind of the downstream of your
Mm-hmm.
model. Yeah. And also when you
100%.
build a model, you're more aware of the limitation of the later on, how
Exactly.
does it go into the distributed system.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're totally right on. There's a lot of pressure for people to be experts in everything. And I'm
Mhm.
a big proponent of not putting that pressure on yourself because, if you let it get away from you, someone will say a data scientist needs to do everything end to end, which is a lot of responsibility. Um, and so it doesn't mean though that you shouldn't, like you said, be aware and be having those conversations, right? Even for your own just like education and enlightenment, like set up a meeting with like your local DevOps person in your company or your local system admin and see like, could you just give me an overview of how these systems work? you
Yeah.
know you don't need to be an expert, but it's good to just know.
Yeah. That's a great point. And before you worked in Activision, you also worked on some signal processing as a chemist. So can you share a little bit about that project and how that helped you understand, anomaly detection?
Yeah, for sure. So it was really interesting we were working on hydraulic fracturing data. So, fracking is something that has a really bad reputation for probably good reason. But from a data perspective, it's fascinating because what you see and what we were looking at were the sensors, the pressure sensors, and the fluid sensors for when actual fracturing was happening. So you're talking about um, looking at data that is 20,000 feet under the ground up to like 10,000 psi of pressure, and the like crazy flow rates of like the water and the sand that's being used is just like overwhelming when you put it into actual like physical terms and think about the reality of what's going on. um, and for me, that work was really interesting for two reasons. Number one was I didn't have a lot of experience with time series data before that. And I think a lot of our world, just by nature of, the physical world, time marches forward, right, is time series data. And it's hard to untangle the time series nature from a lot of problems. And so for me, looking at the way physical systems evolved over time was really fascinating. And then part of what we were looking for, right, when you're fracturing a well, is you're looking for the limits of what the equipment can take. And you need to always be cognizant again of safety and not overdoing things because a pump has a limit, right? Um, any sort of tubing has a pressure limit. It will explode and crack if you exceed it. And so what part of what we were looking for was trying to find signals that things were getting out of bounds for what was allowable for the system. So, can you set up some alerts that, like, hey, you're exceeding something here? Or, hey, there's something interesting going on here.
Yeah. So what type of time series model were you using?
So I didn't actually end up building any like full time series models there. What I ended up doing was for certain channels we were looking at, I would try to decompose them into windowed statistics. So like what was the average or standard deviation of a pressure value over some window of time, and then using that, trying to figure out if I was given some sensor that didn't have, because a lot of times you'll get sensor data and there's no labels on it
Yeah.
because like it's coming from the field, so the data is really messy. If you got a sensor that was unlabeled, could you be like, I know that that's the surface pressure because surface pressure tends to be in this range with these kind of peaks and valleys, or I know that this is volume because the same reason. And so we were trying to figure out how to operationalize messy data and how to
Mhm.
make it less messy and easier for our users. Um, because all the time they spent labeling sensors for us was time that they weren't doing their job.
Yeah. So it's kind of a different type of anomaly detection.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And also for this project, you have to really understand how fracking works. So the domain knowledge, I think
It
it
was
give
a
you,
lot.
yeah.
My direct manager is a petroleum engineer, and so that was her background. And so it was really nice because she was our subject matter expert, but also our data science manager. And so when we would brainstorm ideas or have model results, she was the one that was able to say, like, okay, this makes sense, or this doesn't because of the physics here and here, and like the fluid dynamics here. And so that was critical because I don't think we would have been able to do that in a vacuum.
Mm, yeah. And so you have worked on a lot of projects related to outliers. So I'm curious, do you have any suggestions on, best practices on dealing with outliers? For example, how do you understand them? Do you drop them? What would you do?
I used to be a like drop the outliers kind of person, for sure, when I was like early in my career. Now I'm more of like an embrace the outliers kind of person because I
Mhm.
think a lot of the interesting data science to me happens at the outskirts of a normal distribution. And so that could be something that you have broken data, right? And if you are systems minded, you might want to figure out like what's wrong with this data. It could be a broken sensor, it could be bad code somewhere pulling in data in the wrong way. Um, and then it could also be that when you're looking at those outliers, there's something in your system you didn't expect, right? So there's some bad actor doing something they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where all of the interesting behavior happens.
Hmm.
I would say, from a technique standpoint, I really came to love there's an imbalance learn library, IMB learn. It's basically
IMB
set up,
learn.
yeah, it's like sklearn, but imbalance learn, and
Mm,
it's great. It has a lot of resources and documentation about how to leverage different imbalanced classifiers and
hmm.
and really just like imbalanced data in general. And another one of the things that I ended up finding that was super useful, I think there's a bunch of different approaches to imbalance classification. One thing I found is that artificially balancing my training data has given me a lot more predictive capability than I would have thought. And I know
Hmm.
that there are people who will, say, no, you should train on the actual distribution of the data. But I think from what I've seen, artificially balancing is like one of the biggest tools you can use that if you're having trouble finding the signal, try that and you might be surprised. But
Yeah.
always
Do
test
you,
on your normal distribution, right, in your
right.
data.
So do you use something like a downsampling, upsampling method?
Yeah, it depends. I've been lucky in my career that most of the data science problems I've worked on, we have more than enough data.
Hmm.
So usually I'm able to downsample the majority class. I have worked with trying to artificially create and artificially oversample the minority class.
Hmm.
So, things like smote. What I ended up finding though is that none of those methods really gave me exactly what I needed. And I think the way that you make fake data, obviously, if it's not good fake data, you're really not gaining anything out of doing that.
Mm.
And so I think I actually never heard anyone have a good experience with fake data like that. And
With
I maybe
smoke?
it's just the people I've talked to, yeah, where
Yeah,
it's
I was
actually
gonna
helped the
just say the
problem.
same thing. I think we always try to use
Yeah.
that because I'm sure some people have got something from it, but from my own data point and some people I know, I don't think we have used that in production. I think it's just a really difficult thing,
Yeah.
um, especially when you have multiple dimensions
Yes.
and the data point you generate is kind of going back to the, you know, understanding machine learning kind of the transparency part. You don't really know that data
Yeah.
point, what does it mean. I think it could work if it's some for example time series or some some data has that distribution that is very standard and has some very obvious cycle, that maybe having something artificial can fall exactly in that position.
Yeah.
But I think for other data set where there's already a lot of noise, I think introducing more noise, more variation that we don't understand, I don't think a lot of data scientists feel comfortable to put that in
Yeah.
production.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there. I would be
Yeah,
interested to hear from people who have used it in production to good end, because
yeah,
I've never met anyone who did.
right.
We should do like a smote survey.
Yeah. Previously, we talked about getting buy-in in the leadership, and then sometimes the model output from machine learning, we have to kind of interpret that, and at least internally we want to have more um, transparency, um, interpretable results. So how do you get buy-in from leadership? How do you translate your kind of output to impact?
I like to think that I'm pretty good at this. I think that I have some places where I'm not as great. For me, it's been, like you said, all about making results as interpretable as possible and framing them in a way that the business cares about.
Hmm.
So if you want to go to execs and say, I got 1% more accuracy, they're not going to care, right? But if you say, I'm able to save us $1 million in missed revenue, right? And that translates to 1% accuracy. Now people are listening to what you have to say.
Yeah.
Um, and this also doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? I think that trust is something that's built over time. And it's something that needs to be nurtured with your stakeholders, just like it is in your personal relationships at home, right? Like
Hmm.
there's an aspect of talking about what you build. If something you build doesn't perform like you thought it would, being open and honest about maybe why something's failed, right? Like there's no shame in something not working. And if anything, if you admit, like, oh gosh, this didn't work the way we thought it would, we're going to go back to the drawing board, those kind of conversations, I think, um, engender more trust in the process than just trying to be like, well, if the data was better and making excuses about why something might not be exactly what we thought it would be. And so I don't know, I always strive for a culture of trust around everything I'm doing and trying my hardest to make sure that that's achieved. And it's not always easy and I'm not always great at it, but if that's the goal, I think it makes life a lot easier.
Yeah, I think that's very important because a lot of data scientists, when I started their career, including myself, when something doesn't work, which is pretty common, we
Yeah,
scared to tell our managers this doesn't work. But
it
eventually,
happens so
you have to
much.
tell them.
Yep. Or
Yeah,
like even, oh my gosh, I made so many mistakes early in my career. Like, so I had all this data leakage and I didn't notice it. And I think having those honest conversations are so much better than like scrambling or trying to be like, oh, don't tell them. I hope no one finds out. I'll just leave this running and hope no one notices that the results are bad.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's like the shift from going to school versus the industry, and
Yes.
then going to in school or like at home, if you made some mistake, you get yelled at.
Yeah.
So we kind of always have the fear that, oh, if my model doesn't perform well, someone's going to fire me. We
Yeah.
have that kind of very irrational fear. But I think after you have those conversations a few times, I mean, of course, with a good manager, I think they also just want to understand more about the project and help you to grow, help you solve the problem. And there should be multiple paths to success. And maybe you just
Yes.
try something else. It's not your fault. It could be the data or just this approach doesn't work. I think a lot of times we think a lot about ourselves. But if you
Yeah.
take ourselves out of the equation, just from the perspective, I want to solve the problem, maybe I just ask someone else for help or just maybe my manager has some suggestions, so maybe that's a little bit easier for us to talk about those quote unquote, I wouldn't say failures, but just maybe some struggles we face in
Yeah,
projects.
yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So you previously were data scientist and senior data scientist, and now you're a senior manager. What is the transition from IC to leadership?
It's been very interesting. I will say that I was taking on some more leadership responsibilities as I was a senior data scientist. So it wasn't like a super stark transition where then like one day I had all these weird responsibilities.
Mhm.
Um, but it's definitely different. You know,
Yeah.
I miss the day-to-day coding and being more involved in a singular project where I can kind of devote all my time to figuring out a problem, right? And now I'm more in the role where I take a step back and I have other people working on problems, and those are their babies, and I get to let them dive in and do the end to end work. And I'm there to help if they get stuck or to ask questions that I think our stakeholders might ask of them when we present, and to kind of keep them um, feeling like they can be productive, unblocking them if there's anything, that stands in their way data wise or, otherwise. And so it's just different. I'd say that there are things that are more rewarding about being in management than being an IC. Feeling like I can help someone in their career or I'm better utilizing my skills as a mentor is
Mhm.
definitely rewarding. Um, and then, like I said, there are things that, scare me, like knowing that my technical skills are atrophying. And that's just a reality of not doing it every day.
Mhm.
And I need to come to terms with the fact that like my identity is tied to more things than just my ability to build a model,
Yeah.
And like it's a hard thing to kind of cope with.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of people are having this struggle in their transition because it's kind of our identity are sort of defined on this technical skills, how many lines
Exactly.
of code you write. But if you're still doing that, you might not generate enough impact for the organization.
Yeah.
So now you're basically a mini CEO of your product.
Yep.
You have different type of roles. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So you do a lot of mentorship. You also mentor people on LinkedIn. So what are your best advice for data scientists?
To be kind to yourself, right? There's a lot out there. There's a lot of pressure out there to be the best or get the best job or
Hmm.
know everything,
Yeah.
right? And the tech is changing so fast. And so just take it day by day. You're really good at your job. Don't let imposter syndrome get the best of you.
Hmm.
Um, and get out there and do what you love. I mean, the only thing really standing in a lot of our ways is ourselves. And like that's a hard thing to realize when you let fear control what you think you're capable of. So, I think everyone is probably capable of so much more than they even think they are. And to
Yeah.
realize that you have that power is really amazing. And
Hmm.
especially to the women in data science, like you belong here and like you can be as amazing as anyone else at this job.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And do you have mentors? And if you do, what are the most important lessons you learn from them?
I do. I actually, I have some. My first mentor was my first boss. I mentioned
Mm.
petroleum engineer. She has been a guide for me in management, like what it means to be an empathetic leader and what it means to be a principled leader and what it means to
Hmm.
support your team. And, I still go to her and I'll call her when I'm having a tough time or something's going on and I need
Yeah.
help. And it's funny because now she'll call me sometimes and
Oh,
ask for advice. And I'm like, what is going on here?
that's
I don't
great.
know anything, but that's the imposter syndrome. I also have a mentor at Activision who is a more senior technical leader at the company. And he's amazing when I need help trying to figure out how do I frame this? Or how do I overcome this problem I'm having? Or what's the best way to get what I need out of the situation? How do I go to leadership with these questions? And having someone who's been there, who's in an executive leadership position themselves, that's so amazing
Yeah.
because there's a lot of other things that go on behind the scenes that I might not always think about.
Yeah.
Like there's budgeting concerns, there's stakeholder concerns, and, like all these things that I don't probably think about day to day. So it's amazing to get that input from someone else.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And previously, you shared some mistakes you made, for example, dealing with outliers. What are some other mistakes you made in your career?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have left? We could do let's
As
do a
much as
whole
you want.
podcast on all of Carly's mistakes because I think that could be a great hour. Um,
Yeah.
Honestly, probably every data mistake you could think of, from like data leakage, not doing a proper train test split, um, not normalizing data properly at the right point in time. I mean, literally all the gotchas that you hear about in school, I was aware of. And then I proceeded to just walk on into my first job and do them like all in a row. And then I think some other mistakes, like maybe some interpersonal mistakes at work, things like, I don't know, not always giving people the benefit of the doubt,
hmm
being a little too quick to make decisions and not think a little bit before I decide what I'm going to do. I'm a very like always on, get shit done kind of person. And so when I interact with people who are a little bit more reserved or who have a different decision making style, I think I
hmm
can come across as too aggressive and pushy. And I know this about myself and I still do it, And so there's a lot of things that when you're in a corporate environment, you learn as you grow and you get older that like just because someone takes a little longer to decide on something doesn't mean that what they're deciding is wrong. Um, so I don't know. I think for me, there's been a lot of growth in that as I get older. And then there's a lot of things I realize like my way is not the only way. There's been a
mm
lot of change for me in the way that I perceive problems and the way that I perceive what is interesting to solve about a problem, right? I've had to give up a lot of, oh, but we could do this and this would be way cooler, right? Because what we have is fine. And just letting it go and knowing, like, okay, I'm not going to get to do that crazy deep learning project because nobody cares, but it would have been neat.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, and I'm still out here making mistakes every day. So
Yeah. I think that's how you grow, by making mistakes. If you always
yeah,
stay in your comfort zone, yeah, you're never going to grow. So yeah,
yep.
thanks for sharing that. And what are something you feel you only learned in the industry when you started working in the field that you didn't learn in school?
Um, how messy most data is.
Mm,
Definitely, for sure. Not everything is like a nice, clean data set that you get in
yeah.
school. How the reality of putting something into production. So, like I said before, I would think like, oh, once you can start making predictions, this will be great. But the thought of like when, how often, where, what do you do with the predictions? Like
hmm
those very real world conversations about policy were something I never really had to have in school because what you were building was just a recommendation. It wasn't ever going to be used for real. Um, And so for me, that's the thing I think I spend the most time on now is like, what is our policy for what we build?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So, what is something in the machine learning community that most people believe in, but you disagree with?
Oh gosh, this is a great question. I'm gonna have to think about this for a second. Okay, well, I've got a few. First
Okay.
one that comes to mind
Yeah, we can get to
is
all of it. Yeah.
yeah, the first one that comes to mind is that you can do just as much with R in production that you can with Python. And I just refuse to believe it because I think it's way too painful. And I've never done it. So I'm just like completely speaking from ignorance. And then I'm just like, it's not possible. Python's better. So, like, come at me, R people. I'm ready for you. Um, for let's see, there's like so I feel like there's so many like data science myths that people probably believe are true that might not actually be.
Mhm.
I mean, one that's like a little more existential is that like to be a good data scientist, you have to always be doing data science, even when you're not in work. And if you're not doing data science, you're reading about it, or you're building a side project or doing some sort of side hustle. And I don't think that's true just because that hasn't been what I do. I have a lot of hobbies. I will say zero of them involve coding.
Mhm.
I can't think of anything I'd rather do less than sit down and do like a data science problem in my free time.
Yeah.
There was a point in my life where that sounded fun. Now I'm like, get me the hell away from my computer as fast as possible. I need to
Yeah.
get outside. I need to see another human being, not on Zoom. And so I think if the the idea in the community is, and one that I'm guilty of perpetuating myself, right, is that we're always doing data science. We're always talking about data science. Like I've got
Mhm.
these books back here that are like, I'm always reading about data science, right? And like that's a curated persona that I don't think is true. Like,
Yeah.
do I read those books? Sure. Do I read one every week? No way. I'm reading like stupid fantasy novels to get me away from like tech because I can't do tech all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I
I
think
can
more
see the
people should just be
metaverse
honest.
book.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, but like no joke, this is an amazing book.
Uh-huh.
I just got it yesterday.
Yeah.
Um, it just came out 2 days ago, I think. So my
Mhm.
pre-order arrived yesterday, and I'm super
Yeah.
stoked. I'm already like a third of the way through it. But
Yeah. I think we definitely have always have a lot of things to learn as data scientists, but yeah, I agree that you need to have ways to relax. And sometimes when you have a problem, have a bug, some people, like to go for a walk or take a nap,
yeah,
and maybe your brain is kind of secretly solving those problems for you. And I think we need to learn how to relax, and that will make us more productive. And
yes.
I think I kind of secretly agree with you on the R and Python part. I
Oh my god,
know I don't like to pick
people are
sides
gonna
when it
come at us.
come to tools, but I'm just gonna speak from my own experience. Yeah, I haven't seen anything, a lot of things in R in production, but I have to say, in my first team in Amazon, we're a team of statisticians, like economists. We're building some tools, and we at that time we're all coding R. I don't know what do they do right now. So what we did was we have the R scripts, but we have engineers to not like translate into Python, but they kind of create some wrapper in production
Okay,
and
yeah,
then translate that into maybe some shell script to execute that. But that's not like a very complicated
yeah,
machine learning engineering in production. It's more just like a R analytics script. So it's kind of
yeah,
easy to put in production that way. So I would say R can still be in production, but when your model is interacting with a lot of other systems, like you mentioned previously, talk about those microservices, I think it's just easier to do
yeah.
that in Python. But if you have started your career in R, I don't think you need to panic. I think that's how I get started. Just use that to solve whatever problem you need to solve. In fact, R has a lot of great causal
Hmm.
analysis, time series packages. And then when you feel you need to switch to Python, or you just want to try out, it's easy to make that transition. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think for the R people, like pandas and all those libraries are just so much easier for them to use. And then
Yeah.
they get into sklearn and they're like, "What is this? This isn't as good as R." Which I agree. I also started in R, um, but in terms of like a general programming language, like
Mhm.
there's just no comparison. You can do so much stuff in Python that's like not painful, and to do it in R is just so painful with like the wrappers.
Yeah. I
The,
think my biggest thing when I transition is the count from 0.
yeah,
I just thought it was such a weird thing, but now when I think about, I think that's basically every other programming language, but R, you just start
R is
from
like
1.
the only one. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So how do you see yourself grow?
I don't know. Some days I think like I really just want to walk into the woods and never come back out again. like destroy my laptop.
Hmm.
Um, no, I think in all honesty, like what I want to do is just to continue to become more of a subject matter expert in security. So, like for me, my future has always looked like becoming a domain expert. I think that um, I've loved being a generalist data scientist. But when I think about the future of my career, I think about picking kind of one vertical and continuing to go deeper into that. I think there's an argument to be made about staying more on the surface and staying a generalist as well. I think as a data scientist, though, being a generalist can be exhausting because the field is so vast. Um, and so for me, growth just looks like that. It looks like finding whatever my niche is going to be and continuing to get into it.
So looking back your career, what are some struggles you have faced?
There's some pretty standard struggles that I think a lot of women in STEM face. It started from when I decided I was going to be a chemist, kind of followed me up through gaming. And there's a lot of internalized, I think, misogyny that women have from a young age where they're like, oh, should I be doing this? Is this the field for me?
Mm,
That's been a challenge. And then I think stemming from that, and certainly this isn't something that just affects women, I think it affects everyone, is the imposter syndrome.
yeah.
And so at every stage of my career, when I look at the times I was struggling the most, it was when my inner voice was telling me that I was at my worst and that I was very unkind to myself about where I was at in my life or in my career. And I don't know if that will ever stop. I still feel imposter syndrome all the time. But I've learned now how to listen to it less, and how to know that even when I'm feeling like I'm at my worst or I'm feeling like I don't belong where I'm at,
Hmm.
it's going to pass because I always feel like this.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think we all have those feelings. It's like a few moments, but we don't have to use those moments to define ourselves.
Yes.
And I read it somewhere, forgot who said it. If you never experience imposter syndrome, you're probably a narcissist.
That's so true.
I think,
Yeah.
we all have moments when we feel like we're just figuring things out. I think it's just
Yeah.
remember that's how we learn, that's how we grow, and everybody
Yeah.
make mistakes. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing that because you seem to be someone who is very comfortable and very confident. And I think it's powerful for the audience or listener to know if you have those type of moments, and it's normal, like everybody have those type of moments, and then you just need to have the conversation with yourself and then really know who you are and what you're capable of.
Yeah. Totally agree.
And what do you think about the future of data science or machine learning in gaming?
Oh, you know, I think there's going to be even more data scientists getting hired by gaming companies.
Hmm.
I think that gaming is an interesting space because it's not really tech. It's also not totally entertainment because it's
Mm,
techie entertainment.
yeah.
Like there's a whole it's a mishmash of things. And it used to be that, the big, and it still is, right? The game has to get built. So the people who run the company are the game designers and the game engineers. Like they're building the product for us. And it used to be that like 99% of the focus were on those people. I think that those people are learning to rely more on data scientists when they make their game decisions, right? So they're realizing that like just like anyone building any game. Like there's a game theory. There's a theory for how things should play out between two adversaries. There's a theory for what makes a game fun. There's predictions that you can make about who's likely to win any given match, right? Like this goes from every game from chess to Call of Duty, right? And so using the data that they have in an intelligent way to make better games, I think is where the future of gaming is going to go. Trying to understand player behavior so we can make a more fun game, trying to understand player behavior so we can make gaming a safer space and get people out of the game who aren't contributing positively. um, and really just trying to come to terms with all the data that we have. There's been huge strides at big companies like Google to do crazy research and reinforcement learning research, right? And I haven't seen that trickle in a meaningful way into the industry yet. I think there's a future for that.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just going to come from people who are passionate about games and passionate about data science who want to do that kind of research, right? And who can make a business case for it. Because at the end of the day, it has to help the game be better in some way.
Yeah. And for yourself, what is something you're excited about in your life or career right now?
I'm stoked to be in gaming right now. When I joined, I was like, I want to be in gaming because I love gaming. Now the more I read about where people think, Web 3.0 and everything is going to shift to in the future, I think right in this middle of it is going to be gaming. Like I've gotten lucky, like I have at so many points in my career, I think to be in an industry that is about to be at the forefront of what people think of when they think of the future of the internet. And that is funny to me because historically when you were like, I work in gaming, people were like, oh, you're just someone who likes to, mess around and play games. Like you're kind of a lazy person who likes to screw around. There's like this idea that gamers are somehow just like not at the forefront of society and they're just kind of like hanging out in their rooms doing nothing. And so it's going to be funny to see that shift where it's
Mhm.
like, oh, now every company cares about gaming. Now every company wants to buy a gaming company, right? And they want to acquire gaming companies because they're like, oh, this is what the future is going to be.
Mhm.
Um, and so it almost feels like being like the pretty girl at prom, where everyone's like, oh, we want to know what you do now. And it's like, you didn't care about me 5 years ago when I wore glasses and had a ponytail, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And previously you mentioned you have your hobbies to relax, not think about tech all the time. So, what do you do when you're not working on machine learning or gaming?
Okay, so I'm obsessed with houseplants. It's like kind of a problem. I spend a lot of money and time on plants. I'm half of a mind to go downstairs and get my favorite plant and show it to you. But I build these like little greenhouses with like grow lights I find on Amazon, and I have
Hmm.
these little computer fans that like
Oh,
keep the
wow.
air moving in there, and tiny humidifiers, and it's really fun. And yeah, so most of it is around now that it's summer too, like gardening outside.
Hmm.
I just got some hydrangeas that I'm really excited about because they
Such a
have
like
really
adult
beautiful
hobby
flowers.
gardening.
Gardening, I know. I'm telling you, you will not find me at the computer after hours. You might find me playing video games, but when I'm not
Mhm.
gaming, I'm like outside fretting over this like one hydrangea bush. I'm like the crazy lady in the neighborhood. they're like, they're like, she's always out there looking at that plant. Um, but yeah, I mean, I also like uh, I like to just, I like to get outside and do all sorts of things. I
Mhm.
also like to mountain bike. And so summertime is like my time to do that. Mhm.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I was joking, but I actually read something like doing gardening is very like meditative. It's good for your like mental health. I think a lot of my friends during the pandemic they pick up the hobby to
Yeah,
do gardening. And I live in an apartment. I don't have a garden, so I'm jealous. So my way of gardening is just like doing my dishes.
that's okay though. We all have our thing. And if you ever want to buy a plant, I'll give
Mhm.
you some good recommendations based on where you want to put
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I will let you know. Um,
but don't
thanks
get
for
in too
sharing
deep.
that.
It can get really expensive.
Yeah. I think it's really cool you have those hobbies that not related to data science and tech. So for people who want to follow your career, see your read your LinkedIn, read your posts on LinkedIn or somewhere, where can people find you?
They can search Carly Taylor. I should know my URL, but I do not.
Hmm.
But yeah, you'll see me. I've got my gaming headset on and I've got a little slot machine in my name. Cha-ching.
Nice. So it's on LinkedIn.
Yeah, CarlyTaylor.
Hmm. Cool. Are there anything else you want to share with the audience?
You want to see my Spyro?
Yeah.
This was one of my favorite Activision games. when I was little.
Mhm.
Spyro the Dragon. So he
Yeah.
just flies around,
Oh,
and
that's so cute.
it's a cute little game if you ever want to play something that's like
Yeah.
casual and fun. And as the world gets crazy and we don't know what's going on,
Mhm.
sometimes you need an escape. And
Yeah,
that's
I
what I
think you
play
have
when I'm
you
feeling
have the
stressed.
best Zoom background. You don't need the artificial one. You have some books about data science, the uh
My little
yeah.
dragon.
Yeah, your little dragon and your plant.
Yeah, my plant. That's
Awesome.
me in a nutshell.
Yeah. Cool. I really enjoyed our conversation. I learned more about you and the cool project you worked on at Activision. And I'm looking forward to read more about your career from LinkedIn.
Yay! Thank you so much. I had so much fun.
Thank you.